Currently, my top ideological enemy is certainly the MAGA crowd, but I do want to spend another video bitching about the Marxist far left because, firstly, some radical communist ideas can make people cynical about voting and reduce the election turnout, which is pretty tragic in my view. And secondly, some young people love communism so much that they have a thing for Russia by association, and that affects their foreign policy judgment and gives Trump a pass for selling out to Putin. Last time I made a video criticizing the communist theories in an accessible way, and apparently some people thought that was all I knew. Guys, I admit I wasn't very successful as a scholar, but I did manage to get a PhD in political science and published a book specifically about how institutional design affects equality. So I'm not gonna bullshit you guys. My Marxist training in Chinese high schools in the 90s, they were propaganda driven, sure, but they involved a lot of details. Those exams were not easy to pass, guys. I bet none of the TikTok communists can handle them. So today, I want to address Marx in a more technical way. If you claim to be a Marxist, you must have heard the term socially necessary labor time. It's such a fundamental concept of the entire Marxist conceptual framework. Everything from the exchange value to the surplus value to the concept of exploitation to the idea of communist revolutions all depends on this little concept. Am I right? And that concept happens to be terrible. Let me first give you a brief overview of Marx's main logical chain. First, a commodity's exchange value is determined by the socially necessary labor time to produce it. And then, labor itself has an exchange value which is determined by the socially necessary labor time to maintain the worker. And three, the hours of labor a worker can provide to its employer is larger than the hours of labor required to maintain the worker. The difference between the two became the profit of the employer, aka the surplus value. And then, since the surplus value goes to the employer, not the worker, employment is essentially a form of exploitation. There are many holes in this deductive process, but I don't have time to go over all of them. The only thing I want to talk about is the first statement, the starting point of the entire story, without which the Marxist theory would collapse. So what the heck is socially necessary labor time? Marx said the socially necessary labor time of a commodity is the average quantity of labor time that must be performed under currently prevailing conditions to produce it. That's a very problematic definition because average and prevailing are both loaded words without a clear meaning. How common does a condition need to be called a prevailing condition? It's a quantitative concept, so how do you quantify it? If a condition shows up 30% of the time but more common than other conditions, is that considered a prevailing condition? And what does he mean by average labor time? Is it a simple average or a weighted average? If it's a weighted average, how do you assign weights to each worker? The simple average doesn't really make sense. Let's say a skilled carpenter is able to make a chair in half an hour, but it takes a clumsy guy like me maybe a week to make the same chair. So if you take our average, should it be 3.5 days? That doesn't sound right. So I suppose he meant a weighted average. That carpenter has a higher weight because he has a larger market share. So when calculating the average, we consider him more than me. That's problematic too because the number of chair makers who enter the market can fluctuate in response to the short-term market price. So the socially necessary work time and the exchange value will both fluctuate. Less productive producers and workers join the market when the price is high, and they get squeezed out when the price is low. That's a big problem for Marxian economics because his whole theory depends on the assertion that The exchange value is inherent to a commodity, and the demand, or what he called the use value of a product, does not affect the socially necessary labor time or its exchange value. If that inherent nature of the exchange value is wrong, then everything downstream is wrong, including the concept of surplus value, because the surplus value depends on the inherent exchange value of labor staying unaffected by the demand. I know it's a little confusing. It's confusing exactly because Marx didn't think it through. He didn't have the statistics tools at the moment. So unlike modern social scientists, he didn't pay much attention to the testability of his theory. How to measure each variable, how to collect the data, not so much. He was so passionate about labor, and he thought every economic activity must be ultimately determined by the amount of labor. It was more like a faith to him than a scientific discovery. If you really took your time to understand the Marxian economics, deep down you must know I'm right. That doubt must have been lingering in your head for a while. You just can't quite articulate it because you have this disdain about modern economics. I, however, spend a lot of time learning both kinds of economics. I can tell you the newer stuff is better. Okay? More rigorous logical models and more careful data analysis. Some people tell me modern social sciences are just controlled by some mysterious capitalist interest groups, and the journals only publish stuff that capitalists want. Like how? Those hundreds of top journals are all double-blind peer-reviewed. All those nerd reviewers are individually bribed by capitalists. How? Now I'm going to say something you really don't want to hear. The concept of exploitation is also wrong, because the long-term price or exchange value of the labor is simply not inherent or constant. So the surplus value is not guaranteed. Then why do capitalists have most of the profits? Well, part of it can be easily explained by the collective action problems in modern game theory. When 1,000 people try to negotiate with one person, they have competing interests against each other, and it's hard for them to coordinate and issue a common demand. By the way, that's why an industry's labor condition would improve almost instantly when workers become unionized, right? That doesn't involve a control of means production, okay? I'll give you a thought experiment. Imagine there's a super worker who's able to operate 1,000 machines at the same time, and he's the only worker in town. And then there are 1,000 capitalists who each have a machine. Now you tell me who will end up enjoying most of the profits, the worker or the capitalists? That, of course, is not a realistic scenario because the number of available workers is almost always larger than the number of available capitalists. So yes, capitalists do have an unfair advantage, but that's not due to the inherent exchange value of labor, but due to the collective action problem and the scarcity of capital. When China just started the economic reform, there were a few special economic zones that allowed foreign investment. And of course, the workers in those zones immediately became multiple times richer than the rest of the country. Why? Because the capital-labor ratio changed. The inherent nature of the workers didn't change, but their bargaining power changed. You see what I mean? Another advantage of capitalists versus workers is their ability to take risks. Let me give you another thought experiment. If a bank offers you $1 million of low-interest loan, but you are required to spend all of them on stocks or business investment. In other words, you will become an instant capitalist, but with borrowed money. Would you do it? I can tell you that I would not take that deal. I'm too poor to take that much risk. Yes, the investment is likely to make me richer, but likely is not enough. What if the stocks crash and I don't have money to pay back the bank? I'll be toast. A capitalist can earn a lot of money, but they can also lose a lot of money. Okay, about 20% of new companies fail within 2 years, and only about 1/3 last more than 10 years. So capitalists do lose money. But of course, most capitalists are people rich enough to take some losses. Because they won't be crushed by the 20% chance of losing money, they can better take advantage of the 80% chance of earning money. So sometimes the surplus value we observe are simply the risk premium in modern economics. Rich people have an easier time getting richer because they can afford risks. That's why I'm a big fan of the welfare states. They collect high taxes from rich people to build a social safety net so everyone can be a little bit adventurous. They can afford to quit their jobs to open a store or learn a new skill or write a book. They can afford to lose. That's how you equalize opportunities, not by eliminating capitalists, but by giving everyone a chance to become one. So the bottom line is, well, I share Marx's concern about the imbalanced bargaining power between the labor and the capital. He provided a wrong theory to explain it, and consequently a wrong prescription to solve it. Actually, he hardly offered a prescription at all. Nothing was operational in his writings. All the operational stuff was later invented by Lenin out of thin air. Lenin was a really productive and elaborate motherfucker. His writings could fill a whole shelf, but quantity doesn't equal to quality. Nobody's reading those anymore, I can tell you. Not even the hardcore communists. Lenin somehow managed to make people believe that if the state captures the means of production, the exploitation will be gone. Like, how stupid is that? Is the state not run by people? Like, if Trump nationalizes all the American factories, you think he will stop exploiting the workers? The state is run by people and people are greedy. Why would they give up the chance to exploit you when they have even more bargaining power? So Marx was probably just mistaken, but Lenin was outright gaslighting. And don't get me started with Stalin. That guy's only policy tool was executions. So let's turn the page, guys. There are plenty of good and new ideas that are empirically tested. Try my book, for example. Marxism is a thing of the past. Get over it.